combined team that was approved of by the National Organization
It's
for...
the same God. Okay.
So I was bridging making bridges between Dominicans and Jesuits. It's
beautiful. I've got a lump in my throat now. Did you then, or do you now, trash talk your opponents?
Oh, it's sport in itself to heckle, of course.
Okay. See my point? Now, some of that then is Jesus and the Pharisees. You know, I mean, in some respects, trash talking one another. Guys will do that. And I don't know about women. Do women trash talk their opponents? Do we have any methods here?
I kind of do.
Okay. Oh, yeah, well, yeah. Right.
It's not right in front of their face.
No, but in front of the judge you might. The judge, I don't know where she went to law school, but by God, that's why she actually managed to pass the bar with an argument like that. Okay? Now, these people who consider themselves to be, if you will, a reformed branch of Judaism were Torah observant. Okay? Now, some of them were ethnically something else. Again, remember, we're not talking about ethnicity, we're talking about a series of theological commitments. So what did distinguish one Jewish, and I'm using the language here advisedly, but one denomination from another in the first century? Note the picture there. What are those things we're looking at? Columns, or as those of us who are architecturally astute call them, pillars. Okay? And there was something called the 5 pillars of Judaism. And it was this is right out of Josephus, that every Jew, whether Pharisee, Sadducee, Essene, Zealot, Therapeutai, whatever else, believed that there was one God. Okay? One God who had called into being one people through Abraham, who had given this one people one land upon which to live, who had given them one law by which to live, and who had promised to live with them in that one temple. These are the 5 pillars of Judaism: one God, one people, one land, one law, one temple. This is right out of Josephus's Jewish Antiquities, which is the work he writes to really describe Judaism to non-Jews. He says this is what makes us distinctive. Now what's really interesting then is what distinguished one group, Pharisee, Sadducee, etc., from another, was the relative importance that they assigned to each one of these secondary affirmations here. The primary affirmation is there is one God, right? But these secondary affirmations, depending upon who you were, you would place a great deal of emphasis on one and maybe not so much on the other. So, for instance, Pharisees expressed a great deal of importance with respect to the one law. You know that from reading the Gospels. The Sadducees, on the other hand, placed a great deal of importance on the one temple. Okay? The Zealots placed a great deal of emphasis on the one land. Okay? Because they thought the Romans didn't belong there, we need to unite militarily and expel them from the land. All right? So, I think this is just really kind of fascinating. Where Jesus is concerned, one way you can kind of think about Jesus, and for that matter, ultimately Paul of Tarsus, is how he sought to get people to reassess their understanding of all these pillars of Judaism. In calling God his Father and referring to himself as the Son, clearly he is getting them to reassess their understanding of the one God. That within the one God there is this, as later generations would put it, there are persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. The one people. Ultimately, we'll see that Jesus, by, first of all, bridging the gap, as Troy would do, between north and south, by bridging the gap between male and female, by bridging the gap between slave and free, and ultimately by even extending the his own healing mercies to non-Jews, he's really kind of creating a new people. Okay? The one land, again, by going from one end to the other and not observing, so to speak, the boundary between Galilee in the north and Judea in the south, he's seeking to get people to reassess their understanding of what constitutes the one land. His disputes with the Pharisees over the applicability of the law are, of course, aptly chronicled in all 4 Gospels. Okay? The one thing that's really interesting is that, and I don't want to get distracted on this, but Jesus seems to have very little use for the one temple. Remember, he goes to Jerusalem and he knocks over the benches of the money changers, the table there. And it's not just that he doesn't believe that you should do commerce in the temple. This was a kind of a boundary between the sacred and the profane. So even if you are, coming in from, Qumran or somewhere to the temple, you've got to change your money there. And those of you who've traveled know that that's the first thing you do when you arrive in a new country, right? You change your dollars for euros, or you change your dollars for pesos or something like that. And there they had to change their money for temple shekels, indicating that they had crossed a boundary between the sacred and the profane. So when Jesus sort of knocks over the money changers' tables, he's basically saying, we're going to erase this boundary between the sacred and the profane. Now, relate that to his sayings like, consider the lilies of the field, as a way of trying to understand who God is. Or watch a woman kneading out dough and you'll understand what the reign of God is all about. So Jesus seems to have thought that the temple is ultimately not necessary if you want to encounter God. You can encounter God by looking at the lilies of the field in your own backyard. You can encounter, God by watching your next door neighbor make bread. That God is able to be found anywhere, not just as a result of going on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Okay? Now, as I say, I don't want to get distracted here about all that stuff, but as I say, the primary way of distinguishing then one group from another is the relative importance they place on the one people, the one land, the one law, the one temple. Everybody agreed, though, and this is important, there is only one God. Okay? And this notion that there might be other gods would be repugnant to Jesus, to Paul, and to their contemporaries who believed in this one God. The other thing is, no matter who you were, Pharisee, Sadducee, Essene, whatever else, you believed in the works of the law. And I want to explain what that phrase means today, because this is a very technical term. The works, if there are 5 pillars, there are also 5 works of the law, right? And they are these: circumcision, surgical removal of the foreskin of a little boy; dietary restrictions, so you don't eat pork, and you don't eat shellfish, and you don't eat meat that's been stewed in its mother's milk, and all of that, You observe certain calendar occasions. The Sabbath, every 7 days. Pentecost, Passover, etc., okay? All these special feasts and seasons. Now, Catholics can really relate to that, right? Okay, because we've got our own feasts and seasons that we observe. And that's why, I've told you I've got a Jewish brother-in-law. He feels very comfortable in my overwhelmingly Catholic family because he said, you guys are just Jews, but you eat more than we do. Now, the other thing they observe is endogamy. Only marrying members of the group. Okay? So a young Jewish boy is supposed to marry a young Jewish girl. And you don't marry outside your religion. And frankly, a lot of cultures are like that, including subcultures within America. When I was teaching in Houston, a third of our students were Vietnamese, and they reported that the expectation that they were under is to only marry other Vietnamese. Okay? That's endogamy. And then temple service. If you lived on the land, you were in either Judea or Galilee, you were expected to go to Jerusalem and make a pilgrimage to the temple at least 3 times a year. If you lived in the diaspora, outside the land, like Paul of Tarsus growing up in Tarsus, you were expected to make a pilgrimage to the temple once in a lifetime. So in some respects, that practice of diaspora Judaism is very comparable to the Muslim practice of the Hajj, where you're supposed to go to Mecca once in your lifetime, and if you can afford to go there more than that, you should pay the fare and upkeep, whatever, accommodations for folks who can't afford to go on their own. So that seems to have been the way in which diaspora Judaism regarded temple service. From an anthropological point of view, this is a boundary-setting practice. Every culture has boundary-setting practices. I watched the last quarter of the Super Bowl, right? The best quarter of the Super Bowl, apparently. Kind of astonishing what happened there. I didn't get to see the opening thing because I was actually, I'm a priest. Sunday I'm working, okay? And that day, particularly, I was working because I was celebrating with a group of Dominican sisters out in California their jubilees. There were 5 women who were celebrating 50 years. So there was 250 years of ministerial experience between the 5 of them, which is pretty impressive. Okay, but it started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which would have been 5 o'clock on the East Coast. So as we were beginning the name of the Father, somebody was singing. Who sang the national anthem this year at the Super Bowl? Were y'all watching it? Some guy. Okay. What did you notice?
I think it was Spangled.
Who was it? Do you remember? Luke Bryan? Okay, that is some guy as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I think I know that he exists, but I'm not sure I could actually identify his voice. Okay, okay, so what did people do when he began with O Seke Nusi?
Stand.
They had to stand, and what did probably 90% of them do? They took off their hats, probably, and then the hand over the heart. Okay? Now, I mean, where do you learn to do this? I guess in school. Though a lot of times it ends up, no pun intended, but it's kind of schooling behavior, you know? If the opening strains of the national anthem start and everybody else leaps to their feet, what are you likely to do? You're likely to follow along because we are little better than fish. The lead fish changes direction, all the other fish change with him, right? You know, if the lead goose changes direction, all the other geese follow after. We're fish and we're geese, okay? So if somebody leaps to their feet, we're liable to leap to our feet as well. And if somebody snatches off their hat, if they're a guy, interestingly, I think if you're a woman and you're wearing a hat, you're not required to take it off, right? Oh, you are required?
No, it's correct.
You do not take it off, okay? And then I guess everybody is expected, and it's the right hand over the heart, except that technically your heart's here, okay? Well, you're a lawyer, you're not going to know that, but... No, we had a medical student here, right? Yeah, there you are. Isn't the heart right here? Yeah, it's mostly right here. But we kind of put it over here. We kind of go far to the left, okay? Even though the heart's not there, yet we think that the heart is there. And I guess that's what counts, right? Okay? Now, I'm not sure why this signifies allegiance, except that it does. Okay? That's what we've decided this means. If I stand and I place my hand technically over my left pectoral muscle, or, you know, what passes for one, you know, then we're somehow showing our patriotism. All right? Now, so it's a boundary-setting practice. That's the point. I don't know, what do Canadians do? Do you have any Canadian nationals here? Anybody who's ever been to Canada? But by the way, why is it that if they're called Canadians, shouldn't the land be called Canada? There should either be Canadians who live in Canada or Canadians who live in Canada. So we can take that up with somebody who's a friend of yours from Canada. I don't know what Canadians do when their national anthem is sung. Does anybody know?
I think it's the same.
Well, I think they stand at attention, which is technically what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
We're not supposed to actually put our hands over the heart.
We're not.
No.
What people do.
I know, yeah. It's for the rule. It's
that's
just supposed to be
like-
attention. You're just supposed to stand at attention during the national anthem.
Huh.
So,
Supposed to?
yeah.
Well, again,
I mean,
what's
it's
really
just like
interesting
practice.
about a boundary-setting ritual is that nobody really knows why. We just do it. Okay? And Catholics begin their prayer typically with the sign of the cross. If we were Presbyterians, we would not. Okay? And if we were Orthodox, we would do it differently. We would go up, down, right, left. We, Catholics, do up, down, left, right. Okay? Why? Who knows? We just do. And that's how we show we're not Orthodox or we're not Presbyterians. I don't know whether I told you this. When I was doing my doctoral work, I had a reason to spend a summer in Oxford. And this is why, I'm a little bitter about this even today. Neither the Jesuits nor the Dominicans had any room for me. So, because they both got houses there at Oxford, and they got big houses at Oxford, and I'm sure there was some, janitor's closet they could have given me to sleep in, but they didn't, okay? So I'm not bitter, but I found, well, I am bitter, but I found a place at Wycliffe Hall, which is an evangelical house. They're basically Methodists from our point of view, but they're very hospitable. It was a really comfortable room. And so I would decide to go down to their chapel to do morning prayer with them. And it's one thing you can do without worrying about intercommunion and those kind of things. Just say the Psalms and all that. So I sit in their chairs pretty much like this. I sit in the chair kind of waiting for it all to begin. And the leader of prayer that they said, "Let us pray." You know what a nice Catholic boy does when somebody says, "Let us pray"? I leap to my feet because that's what we do. And nobody else did. They all sort of, did that kind of face plant almost in their laps that evangelicals do. And I kind of slumped down to my seat, hoping that nobody noticed that I kind of didn't know the rules. Okay? So a boundary-setting practice, in some respects, well, theoretically, it links you to some transcendent purpose. Patriotism, prayer, something like that. Also, in its horizontal dimensionality, distinguishes us from them. Okay? So it has usually a theoretical orientation that's vertical, but it has a communitarian orientation that's horizontal and exclusive. Okay? It doesn't so much mean to unite the community as it means to exclude those who don't do what we do. If you've ever brought a non-Catholic to church, what do you do with them? You talk them through it. I think we're going to stand up here in a minute. Now you're going to kneel. I know you've never done that before, but try. These are Catholic calisthenics, Okay, now, here's the deal. Jews in the first century believed that the works of the law were signs of the covenant and therefore gave them privileged access to God. If you do these things, if you circumcise your son, if you don't eat pork, if you go to synagogue on the Sabbath, if you marry a nice Jewish kid, if you go down to the temple, either once in your lifetime or once every 3 months or whatever it is, you are a child of Abraham. You have privileged access to God. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Paul believed in the one God, etc. He did not preach, or rather, I put it this way, he preached a gospel free from the works of the law. That you could have privileged access to God without circumcising your children or yourself, without observing dietary restrictions, without keeping a calendar, without marrying a nice Jewish girl or a nice Jewish boy, and without ever going to the temple. This was very controversial. Okay? I think we can see why Torah-observant Christians would have opposed Paul's mission. On the one hand, because he would come in, I remember he was talking to pagans, effectively, polytheists. He had to demonstrate to them that there are not many gods, but one. Okay? That they approved of. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, whatever else, they were evangelical in that sense of the term. They believed that it was appropriate to tell others about the one God and to convince them to drop their erroneous way of thinking that there might be many gods. These are but figments of the imagination or demons or whatever else, depending upon that. But from their point of view, to fail then to introduce these Gentiles to the works of the law was in fact to fail to deliver the complete truth. And not telling people the complete truth from that point of view looks like a lie. Right? You've only given them half a loaf and not the entire thing. So one objection then to them is he's just not telling them everything they need to know. You can't have privileged access to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Leah, the God of Rebekah, blah, 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 until you practice all 5 works of the law.